Sri Lanka's political stage has come to a point of certain uncertainty and what is going to happen to the future of the government. Good evening and welcome to Vantage Point with me, Zulfikar Farzan, and joining me as usual this evening is Dr. Dayan Jatilika, a very veteran diplomat, if we may call, and an expert in Sri Lankan politics and global politics as well. Good evening, Doctor.
Good evening, Zulfikar.
Doctor, let me start off by asking you this simple question. If this government cannot function anymore, where is this country heading to?
Well, at the time of recording, we are on the eve of the vote on the no confidence motion. But by the time the show airs, i.e. when our viewers are watching us talk, the result of that motion would have come in and we would know where we stand.
Indeed.
Now, there is clearly a crisis of governance in this country. Check out what's happening at the Pradeshiya Sabha level. The excuse is that this is a new type of structure and a new electoral system. Now, that is absolute Tommy rot, Sophie. I've lived through so many changes of structure, of system, of electoral systems, from the Westminster model, first past the post, to proportional representation, to PR before the preference voting system, so PR after the introduction of preferential voting, then new institutions such as the provincial councils, which did not exist till 1988. So we've been through all these changes and I've never seen this kind of paralysis and people fighting each other, allegations of bribery and so on. The system isn't working. There is a crisis of governance. Now, the no confidence motion against the Prime Minister, which is centered on the bond scam, is, however, a symptom of this crisis of governance. It's also an attempt to resolve it, because there is a school of thought that if the PM, who is perhaps the most gangrenous of the greens, as I put it, is surgically removed, then it will be possible to recompose the government and move forward. Now, I agree with that. But then there is the possibility that the Prime Minister will neither resign nor will be defeated in the vote, possibly because of the TNA's support. Now, if that happens, and there is no change in the post of the PM, then you have an enormous crisis, because the Sri Lanka Freedom Party will move out, at least most of it will move out. There's a clear rupture looming. Then you have an SLFP president, you have the SLFP out of the government, you may have the TNA in the government with the UNP, no two-thirds majority, the SLFP going into the opposition and swelling an already very strong opposition of 54 belonging to Mahinda Rajapaksa's JO. Now, if the SLFP goes in there, it will either join the JO and Mahinda, or it will sit separately, perhaps with some UNPers who also voted for the no confidence motion and constitute a second opposition. But together it will be a very formidable opposition. So, if the PM stays on, i.e. if the surgery doesn't take place or if it fails, then you have a terrible crisis. It's not going to help at all. So we don't know what would have happened by the time this airs.
Indeed.
But we do know that if things go one way, i.e. if the PM either steps down or is defeated, then the situation becomes fluid, a new beginning is possible, and it's not so bad, because the president can then recompose the government and we can move on. The safety valves open up. But if the PM stays one way or the other, then the safety valves remain shut. He loses his moderate partner, the SLFP, but he still has to deal with an SLFP president, and he will face a very strong opposition from below and on his flanks. That is the JO plus the SLFP. So that doesn't augur well at all for the government.
Doctor, one question that I wanted to ask you was, from what you just said, Now, if the president composes a new government, possibly after the prime minister steps down, and there will be a much more stronger force in the opposition, as you mentioned, the JO, then the breakaway factions of the SLFP, and those who vote against the prime minister from the UNP. So, in such a situation, how about a scenario where the new composed government is going to face an even more worse battle with a strong opposition?
Well, it depends on what kind of government it is. If it is Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, the UNP and possibly the TNA, then he will face a very strong opposition of the JO plus SLFP.
Yes.
But if Prime Minister Wickremesinghe either steps down or is defeated at the no confidence motion vote, then there's a greater flexibility. The president can then appoint a less polarizing personality such as Karuja Surya or Sajid Premadasa if he wants a UNP prime minister, or he can pick somebody who is senior from the Sri Lanka Freedom Party. And the JO has promised to support an SLFP prime minister. Now, I don't know what it will do if it's a UNP prime minister, but even a UNP prime minister will be less of a hate symbol than the present prime minister for the JO.
It appears to be a thought of not the party, but the individual.
It does happen. If you go back in time, Sir John Kotalawala was a very polarizing figure, and it is he who triggered the ultra-nationalist Sinhala backlash that led to the specific nature of the 1956 changeover, Sinhala only and so on. You have that, along down the road. It's not the case always, but it is often the case. And here, yes, it is the personality and the neoliberal policy package of the Prime Minister that has caused this polarization and the virtual collapse of the UNP's vote base. I mean, they're down to, according to one count, 29%, according to another, 32%. It's never happened to a party in government. It has also caused a crash in the SLFP's vote base to 13%. And that is because of association with Prime Minister Wickremesinghe. I say this because the SLFP's own brothers, as it were, that branch of the SLFP family, which is with Mahinda Rajapaksa, they did brilliantly. They scored 40% or 45%, depending on how you count it, which is more than SWRD Bananayaka got in 1956. And they did that in a few months with their Pohoto, the new party. So why would one branch of the SLFP, okay, there's Mahinda's personality, that's fine. But why would they do so much better than the branch in government? That's because the SLFP voter cannot abide Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, with whom the SLFP has been in government. But right now, from the news we get, the SLFP is clearly rebelling against Prime Minister Wickremesinghe, very openly.
A very thoughtful discussion, Doctor, we are having. We will join this discussion right after this short commercial break. Welcome back to Vantage Point. We were discussing about the continuation of a government or a new government, and also the system that we have in place. Doctor, speaking to you earlier, you said that the system is somewhat of a complete mess.
Yeah.
So, Doctor, the question now our viewers would have is, who is responsible for this system?
Well, it's those who misunderstood what happened in January 2015. If they had understood it correctly as an election victory of the sort we've had, from 47, it's a new government, it is a center-right government, and if they had proceeded normally, then we wouldn't be in this mess. But some people, I do not know whether these are people overseas, Sri Lankans overseas, or whether these are the politicians here, but some people got it into their head that this was some kind of Arab Spring, which of course it wasn't, because the Arab Spring has now been, proven a failure. But even when it was a success, it took place against the backdrop of regimes that had been there without proper democratic elections for 30, 40 years, such as in Egypt. we've never had that situation. So it couldn't be an Arab Spring. It was not a revolution. But there were those who thought it was some kind of revolution and therefore decided that they had conquered power and that the state itself was the enemy and had to be dismantled. So you had senior civil servants being taken to courts, grilled. The system was being dismantled. But this is the system we've had for decades. This is our state. But the system was attacked by the new government or section of the new government and sought to be dismantled because the army was thought to be an enemy. The military victory that the state scored was thought to be questionable. The bureaucracy that kept us going through 30 years of war with a 5% growth rate was made a target. So naturally, I mean, when the system is crippled by the government, then it no longer works. So I would say it is this ideological dogma, this dream, this delusion that some members of the government, I would say mainly the UNP, not everyone in the UNP, but quite a few in the UNP, were living in. They're still living in that. As we record, there are UNPs who don't see what's happening. I mean, they may or may not win the no confidence motion, but ranking UNPs like Akila Viraj Karyavasam, for instance, are speaking quite openly in terms of, well, we shall prevail at the no confidence motion, and that's going to be the first step in our presidential campaign to make Ranil Wickremesinghe the president of Sri Lanka. I mean, it is this kind of delusional state that existed within the UNP, certainly not Sajid Premadasa, certainly not Ranjit Madhuma Bandara. And that's why people like Palita Ranga Bandara, Sajid, they talk about people with their feet on the ground. Ravi Karunayaka is also talking about people with their feet on the ground. Now, there are those UNPs who never had their feet on the ground. And they thought that this was something like Eastern Europe after overthrowing communism, or the Arab Spring after overthrowing Mubarak, which of course it wasn't. And they behaved in a crazy way, and now you have an economy which has slowed to 3.1%, the lowest growth rate in 16 years, and the last time 16 years you calculate that is 2002. That's when Prime Minister Wickremesinghe was PM in 2002. So when he comes into office and the people around him come into office, they think they're living in another part of the world, and they don't understand the realities of this place, and they get thrown out or they make a huge mess of things, and that's what's happening now. I mean, colloquially they would say, what are these guys smoking? They are tripping out on something.
Indeed, Doctor. Doctor, another question that we've been discussing over these past few days is, now the local government authorities, a majority, the establishment of power has gone to the underdog party, the Sri Lanka Potujana Pehumuna. And whereas in some local government authorities, you find either the SLFP or the UNP securing a majority seats. But then when the appointment of chairman or the head of that local government authority comes into effect, it's someone else from a different party. And there are allegations, as you said, of bribery taking place. We even had sound bites of certain members who said they were offered money to vote for certain individuals. In such a scenario, Doctor, let's say the Prime Minister is defeated at the no confidence motion, a new UNP Prime Minister comes in, for example. If the local government authority is controlled by one party and the central government is controlled by another, which have different polarizing views, how would that affect our journey forward as a country towards achieving our economic goals and our political goals?
Well, I mean, that's the reality. The local government elections have been won by the new opposition party, and that's not going to change. My suspicion is that the same thing will happen at the provincial council elections, because the economy is doing so badly. So whoever the Prime Minister is, the UNP is not going to do well so long as the economy is in a tailspin. Now, it may be in less of a tailspin. It may begin to stabilize if Sajid Premadasa, for instance, is the Prime Minister, or even Karuja Surya or Anjit Madhum Bandara, because these are pragmatic people. But it will be difficult to turn it around. They can decelerate the rate of decline. But to move up from 3.1 in the 1.5 years left before the presidential election, to move it up to anything like even the average of 5% of the wartime, of the long period of war, it's going to be difficult. Certainly, it will be very difficult to move it up to the 6-7% of the Mahinda Rajapaksa period. So, I don't think this government can win whatever shape it takes. I think the real question is whether the Prime Minister will remain, possibly with the TNA support, and there will be some kind of, there will be chronic instability, leading to what I call a hard landing or crash landing at next year's elections, or whether the government will be able to stabilize, normalize, and have a fairly smooth transition and a soft landing to electoral defeat late next year. But I rather doubt that defeat can be turned into victory for this government, whatever the composition of the government.
So defeat and victory. Can this defeat be turned into a victory by the present government? We'll talk about more right after this commercial break. Talking about the government and its defeats and victory. Dr. Dan Jatilaka, let me ask you this question. Let's say the government is defeated at the no confidence motion. And like you said, if you have a hard landing, especially with the economic growth rate at a very low, the lowest in 16 years, as we have heard it from the central bank itself, if that situation happens, are we going to be, or is Sri Lanka going to be, something similar to Somalia, a failed state?
Well, I'd put it the other way around. If the Prime Minister is defeated, there's much less of a chance of becoming a failed state. Because then the President can put in a Prime Minister who's less unpopular and more pragmatic. And the Sri Lanka Freedom Party will remain in the government, together with the UNP or section of the UNP. And the JO will probably support it conditionally. But if the Prime Minister wins, in other words, if the PM fails, we won't become a failed state.
Right.
But if the PM succeeds, we will become a failed state. Because the SLFP will move out. There will be a very powerful opposition, the JO and the SLFP. The Prime Minister will continue along in a merry way with his merry men. And there will be strikes and agitations and turbulence. The economy is in a tailspin. It will corkscrew downwards. And we might become a failed state. But then again, maybe not, because look, how bad can it get? Late next year, you have an election, a presidential election. If we didn't have that opportunity, then we would have become a failed state. But you can't become a failed state so quickly. Well, even if you can, you have an exit ramp coming up late next year. And, you know, it'll all be over late next year. The point is, how will it be over? If the PM has won the no confidence motion by the time this show airs, then it will be a hard landing. We've had that in 1970. We've had it in 56. Harder in 70 because there was violence after the election. And there'll be plenty of people seeking vengeance for what they would consider harassment. But if the Prime Minister moves out or loses the no confidence motion, then there's flexibility introduced. And flexibility and fluidity means that it won't be a hard landing. There's a second chance then. So, very simple. PM Wickremesinghe succeeds more likelihood of a failed government, if not a failed state. If P.M. Vikramasinghe fails, then the government revives, because the president then has the option of picking somebody who can work with him.
Doctor, now the UNP over the past couple of days has been boasting about its control over its members who will be voting in favor of the Prime Minister. And then we also had ministers come out and say, look, what our meetings are centered on is defeating this no confidence motion and fielding a UNP candidate for the 2020 presidential elections. Now, Doctor, let's assume the Prime Minister does not resign. He survives from some way or the other the no confidence motion. If he is fielded as the next presidential candidate for the UNP, what is going to happen?
20%.
It's going to drop down to 20%.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question.
Doctor, in addition to that, the UNP members themselves say that they will no longer support a common candidate, that they want a UNPer to come out.
Yeah.
And even at that time, when journalists pose questions, who is going to be this candidate? It's Ranil Wickremesinghe.
I know. It's hilarious.
So,
I mean, he's just taken the UNP down to 32% of the local government election. That never happens to an incumbent party, a party of government. So, Ranil Wickremesinghe as the UNP's candidate. I mean, if he could have been the candidate, he would have been the candidate in 2015. Why did they woo Mr. Maithripala Sirisena? Because Ranil couldn't win. And he failed to win, and he dodged in 2010 as well. And Sarath Fonseca was the candidate, and that proxy failed. And Mr. Wickremesinghe lost in 2005, and before that in 1999 at the presidential elections. Why would any sane person think that he can win in 2019? There's a quote which is attributed to Albert Einstein, that lunacy is defined by doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So if the UNP thinks that they should and can put Mr. Wickremesinghe forward and do well at a presidential election, well, that fits the Einsteinian definition of lunacy.
in addition to that, Doctor, before we conclude, we heard Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe and the UNP working committee saying that they're going to bring reforms, and it was just last week that I was opposite Srikota waiting to speak to some of the ministers to get their comments on what reforms that they would be making in the party, the restructuring of the party. But what we only got was, we are working to defeat the no confidence motion and we are going to contest separately. So for many years, Doctor, we've been hearing reforms in the UNP, but nothing seems to be happening.
Well, I mean, if something didn't happen for 24 years, even after the NGP Panditharatna report of 2004, NGP Panditharatna was the party chairman under President Jagordhan. Well, it's not going to happen now, and if it were happening, it should have happened before the no confidence motion. So they could have gone in and said, look, we've changed. We are moving target. That's tomorrow, and it's not going to happen. Palitha Ranga Bandara tweeted after a meeting 24 hours ago with the Prime Minister, and he said there's not going to be any change and he's not going to step down from the leadership. So, I mean, that's the change, that's the only change that's meaningful. I mean, if you have a CEO under whose command the market share shrunk, you get rid of the CEO. But if you're keeping the same CEO, you're not going to get your market share to expand. And anybody who thinks that that would happen is, you know, is gaga. So, you know, it's crazy. Either they get rid of Ranil and field somebody else as candidate, or they lose badly. And even if they want to support President Sirisena for re-election, if it's Ranil who is leading the party, I think President Sirisena won't want that support, because with friends like that, you don't need enemies. And that's what has happened to the SLFP. Why is the SLFP rebelling? Why is President Sirisena allowing the SLFP to rebel? Because with friends like Ranil, you don't need enemies.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dan Jathilika, for joining us this evening on Vantage Point. And what is Sri Lanka going to expect after the no confidence motion? And what will happen to the UNP? As Dr. Dan quoted Albert Einstein by saying, lunacy is defined by doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. So we'll have to keep watch and see what happens to Sri Lanka and its political situation. Thank you for joining us. Have a good night.